Okay, want to welcome you to the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association's presentation on the governor's proposed budget that just came out the other day. And we're going to run through state aid runs, how to unravel them, how to understand them. And we're going to use one specific school district state aid runs as an example for you, the board members and members of the governance team, to understand what these numbers are and how they implicate and impact your budget development in the months coming up, and also how you're going to communicate your information about the state aid that is coming to your district to your stakeholders and also to your state officials for advocacy. And we'll also finish up with some advocacy points that we'll be doing as a regional organization to help support you, our members, and school districts. So we'll get right into it. But before we do that, we just want to remind you about a couple of upcoming events that we have. On March 12th, 2025 is our deadline for applications and submissions for our annual School Board Service Awards. Information and nomination packets have been sent to your district clerk, so we highly encourage you to nominate a fellow school board member who you think is deserving of recognition, and they'll be recognized at our annual Business and School Board Service Awards dinner in May at the Hamlet Golf and Country Club on May 28th, 2025. So we encourage you to attend that event as well, and also submit a nomination for one of your outstanding colleagues. We also have an exciting free webinar regarding social media addiction and recovery with a young lady who is really, really impressive, who will take you on her own personal journey for what she went through, breaking herself from the addictive cycles of social media. And then she'll also explain the science of what happens to young people's with their brain synapses and exactly what happens with dopamine, and some actual fascinating scientific information that she's been studying in college about the impact of online screen time and social media. So that is on March 20th. That'll be a free online webinar. We'll send out registration information about that event at a later date, but we just want to mark your calendars for that. And as always, with our free online webinars, we encourage you to register for that, even if you can't attend the live event. So this way you'll get the on-demand link after. And that only goes out to folks that have registered in advance. So those are our upcoming events. And we appreciate your support and your participation in all of our events. And also drop us a line and suggest a webinar or a training that you would like to see in the near future. So let's get right into it. This is the governor's executive proposal for the state budget, and in particular regarding education aid. And she went through her points the other day during her presentation. But to highlight the major points, every district, if you're save harmless or off formula, will get a guaranteed minimum increase of 2% in foundation aid. And they also changed one of the poverty index measures. They updated the census data from 2000 to 2020, and they changed how they're recognizing poverty with one of the recommendations from the Rockefeller Institute's report. And that is driving more aid to high needs districts. So this is the total numbers statewide as per the Association of School Business Officials in New York. And this is a little easier to read, if you will, for lack of a better phrase, breakout of the state aid. This isn't exactly how it appears on state aid runs. That's a little bit of a different look, but this is a little easier to break down. So that is what we're going to be looking at. And if you're a school board member that is not a numbers geek like me, you probably see these numbers, percentage increases, dollar increases, 1.4 billion, almost $1.5 billion increase in foundation aid. You probably look like this after seeing all these numbers, and you're like, what the heck does all this mean for me and for my district? And the other day I received a phone call from a superintendent of schools who received his personal school state aid run and noticed that there was an error on it and had some questions. So I figured I'm going to use that school district state aid run as a perfect example of the devil's always in the details, and what will be reported as this district's state aid increase in Newsday, and that the community will see, is a very different reality from what they are actually getting. So you have to know your own individual district story, talk to your superintendent, your business officials, and they could break it down for you. But I'm going to try to make it simplistic for board members to understand what really are the numbers you should be paying attention to so that you can make informed decisions during budget development and also develop your talking points when you're out there selling your budget to the community. So that school district was the Bayport Blue Point School District, and my good friend, Dr. Tim Harney. He had called because you'll see highlighted there, the UPK number showed an increase of $480,600. And the error is that he didn't get an increase of $480,000 for UPK, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But instead, the state erroneously reported the previous year only being $100,000, and this year is projected to be $580,000, where in fact the previous year was also $580,600. So there's really zero increase in UPK funding, but that impacts what Newsday is going to report and what the community is going to show as an increase in total aid for that district, and will create some conversations that that school district and that Board of Education has to have with their community, because it's not reflective of the reality. So we'll get back into that UPK, but just know on this particular school district state aid run, there's an error of $480,600 in the amount that the state and the media will report as an increase to that school district. The number we need to pay attention to as board members, the only number that really matters as far as what I like to call new money, is your change in foundation aid. We'll go through all the other categories that you see on a state aid run, but from a budget standpoint, there's two things you pay attention to: your change in foundation aid and your projected revenue from whatever tax levy you'll be going out and proposing to your voters. So if you are going out with 2%, which is the maximum, and of course we know 2% isn't 2% due to formulatic changes for our individual district. But if you're going out with 2% and you change in your foundation aid, whatever 2% generates in revenue for your school district, plus your change in foundation aid, that's your new money to deal with your rollover budget or your changes to your budget with salaries, inflationary costs, insurance increases. That's the money you have to deal with. And in an inflationary environment like we've been for the last several years, we've been dealing with a gap. But for Bayport Blue Point, Newsday is going to say their increase is 3.9%. They got the guaranteed minimum increase of 2% on foundation aid because they're on Save Harmless. And their total dollar increase is $689,031. But lo and behold, that is not their true net increase, and we'll get into that and why that is different. So again, the only change you want to pay attention to as board members is your change in foundation. If you're off formula or you only got a guaranteed increase of 2%, you are a Save Harmless district. If you receive more than 2%, you're on formula and you're not Save Harmless. We have more and more districts going into the Save Harmless category over the last couple of years. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Again, we pointed out that the state reported only $100,000 in their UPK aid category from the previous year, which is inaccurate. It was $580,600. So net year over year is actually a zero increase for Bayport Blue Point, not $480,600 as shown here. And again, it's going to be reported that their increase is $689,031, and that's not true. So the devil's always in the details. Total school aid, 3.9%. We already covered this. And we said Newsday, that's what they'll show in there. How much aid did your district get? And again, because of that error in the UPK funding, it is not true. Again, we pointed out how they are a Save Harmless district, so therefore they're only getting the 2% minimum increase, or $233,113 year over year. New money, right? That's all they have in new state aid for their school district. And again, we covered that New funds are changes in foundation aid and the revenue from your tax levy. And the comptroller came out and said the tax cap is at 2% this year, as it was last year. So most likely there will be a gap for districts that are on safe harmless because inflation this year was 2.89%, and the cap is at 2%. So in very simple terms, and it's not exactly that simple, you have a gap of 0.89% with what you could raise locally compared to inflationary costs. And we're showing $233,000 coming from the state in new money to deal with cost changes within your district's particular budget. Now, inflation versus tax caps, the comptroller also sent out this lovely graph. And I would suggest that all of you grab this graph, screenshot it, whatever, because it shows, particularly since 2021, what's been happening to our districts from a budgetary standpoint and why your school business officials have probably been losing sleep over the last several years. Inflation, as we know, has really been out of control over the last several years. In 2022, the inflationary rate was 4.7%. In 23, it was 8%. Then it went down to 4.12%, and then coming in at 2.95% this year. So we've been maxed out at the cap of 2% for the last 4 years, but this has not kept up with the pace of inflation, right? There's a gap. And the gap is 11.14% over the last 4 years. Now, I can tell you, if you're a Save Harmless district, you certainly haven't seen 11% increases in foundation aid. If you were on formula, you got a lot of catching up in your foundation aid that you waited 17 years for, by the way. So those districts that are getting a lot of foundation aid or have gotten a lot of foundation aid over the last couple of years, keep in mind, that's been money they've been waiting for at least 17 years. And the state finally caught up and paid what was due all those districts that would do that amount of money of foundation aid. So, a little bit breakdown of the numbers. In 24-25, last year, 44% of the school districts on Long Island did not receive an increase in foundation aid at all. If you recall, the governor's proposal was to do away with Save Harmless, which would have called for decreases in state aid for those districts, 15 in Nassau, 35 in Suffolk. And the legislature was able to negotiate and fight back instead of Long Island losing $43 million in state aid if they did away with Save Harmless. They negotiated it back, but those districts received a 0% increase as opposed to a cut. So last year, if you were a Save Harmless district like Bayport Blue Point, you didn't receive any new money in foundation aid. And most of us were like, okay, well, it was better than being cut, which was what was originally proposed. Again, the original proposal for Long Island last year would have reduced aid to these districts by $43 million. This year, 54% of our school districts on Long Island are now on Save Harmless. So you see an increase of districts on Save Harmless by 10%. So 54% of our school districts are only receiving a 2% increase. But for 50 of those districts that are in that 54%, they received 0 last year, and they're only proposed to get 2% this year under the governor's proposal. And the rate of inflation for the last 2 years has been in excess of 7%, leaving a gap of about 5% of not having enough new money to deal with the cost of inflation over that same time period. So this is why some of your business officials and your superintendent and your governance teams have been trying to balance the budgets, and maybe you've seen some reductions to your budgets, maybe use of reserves to deal with the gap in an inflationary environment that we've been dealing with for the last 4 years. This is important to point out to your community that there has been a gap between the amount of aid coming out of Albany versus inflation. I would use this graph in almost every budget presentation that you do for your community so that they understand you've been capped at 2%, which has not been keeping up with the rate of inflation. And the amount of aid you've been getting during that period of time from Albany certainly has not been keeping up with that. And you've probably been doing a mix of things, using reserves, reducing programs, or reductions through attrition, whatever things that you and your team have been doing over the last several years, you've been making up that gap for the last 4 years, and we still have a slight gap this year. Might be smaller, but it's still a gap, and it's a cumulative impact. So again, state aid has not been keeping up with the rate of inflation, particularly for districts that are on Save Harmless, which this year is more than half the districts on Long Island. It's 67% in Suffolk County and 41% in Nassau County. So it is even more acute for our Suffolk County school districts. And again, here's the breakdown of the total foundation aid increase for Long Island, broken down by Nassau and Suffolk. And you can see those percentages in total aid and percentage of increases in foundation aid. And again, the number of districts that have received only the minimum 2% increase under the governor's proposal. And again, now the number of districts on Save Harmless have increased by 10% year over year. And we'll get into why that's an important thing to pay attention to a little bit later on, because being on Save Harmless with any changes that will be proposed in the future to the formula is something that we need to pay close attention to, because if they try to eliminate Save Harmless or have a proposal to phase it out over a period of time, more than half of our districts on Long Island will be negatively impacted. So what are the other numbers on a state aid run for my school district? So you have building aid, transportation aid, BOCES aid, public high cost excess aid, private excess cost aid, special services aid. These are different aid categories that will change year over year. But as board members, the only thing that we need to remember and realize is that these are what we call expense-based aids, meaning what you're being reimbursed this year is what you spent the previous year. Transportation aid is a perfect example. You're being reimbursed by the state for your transportation aid based on your aid ratio, and it varies from district to district depending on need. But any changes to these categories, your business officials will already know what they're anticipating based on what they spent the previous year. So they would have known that for whatever the reason, there was a drop in transportation costs by $12,000. They would have anticipated that, they would have planned for that, or they are planning for that within their budget development. So for us as board members, this is a reimbursement of what we've already spent, right? So any changes to this category should not be a surprise. But it's something that we always pay attention to, because some governors have sometimes tried to do away with expense-based aids and do flat grant aids, or just come out with a flat number and not make it reimbursable based on your own expenses, which is things that we've been able to fight back over the years. But for you as a board member, this is not new money. This should not be a surprise, but it does impact your cash flow. But your business officials should already be aware of the changes in these categories. So sometimes on your aid runs, which can impact your number for your total increase, could also be inaccurate. Sometimes your transportation aid numbers may not be accurate, and your business official may sit there and say, look, they're showing us for an increase, but we actually know it's going to be a decrease, or it's not as much of an increase. This is based on claims data that gets sent up to the state at a certain point in time and is always subject to change. So for expense-based aid categories, chat with your business officials about, are the numbers accurate? Are the projections accurate? But again, it's not new money. It's just a reimbursement of what you've already spent, and should not be a surprise. Universal pre-kindergarten. It could be very misleading. And in Bayport Blue Point's case for this year, it's really misleading because it's showing an increase of $480,000, and that's not true. It has zero impact on your general fund. UPK is grant funding. Some districts will have an amount in this category and they don't even spend that every year. It's grant funding. Use it or lose it. It's not carried over. It's not cumulative. It's not part of your general fund. You can only use it for UPK, nothing else. And again, it will paint a different picture as far as your increase in aid, right? In this case, it's showing increase, which is entirely inaccurate. a 480% increase, right? You're going to have that resident that's going to say, wow, you guys got all that money. Where's it going? What are you doing with it? Well, it's reported in error and it's grant funding. Maybe you utilize all of your UPK funding, maybe you don't, but it has zero impact. As board members, keep an eye on it, but don't pay attention to it because it does not impact your budget development and your general fund in any way, shape, or form. So, some other miscellaneous aids that are smaller in categories here, software aid, hardware and technology aid, textbook, library materials, and some other aids. High tax aid and supplemental cost aid. High tax aid was put in place by the Senate way back in the day to really deal with the high tax areas of the state, in particular Long Island. It was the Long Island senators that put this in place. It's been frozen for years, but it's still counted towards your base amount that is part of the state aid, but it's been frozen. So there's no changes in this for years and years and years. Hopefully they don't sit there and say, oh, we're going to take this away or whatever. But again, it's just something to keep an eye on, but it really has zero impact for your district and should be no surprise, right? It's like I said, it's been frozen for a long, long time. I've been at this game for about 20 years, and it used to change slightly, and then it was frozen after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and hasn't changed since. So, but it's still on there. So let's do the math, okay? How much of an increase did Bayport Blue Point truly get? Now, keep in mind, they said that they got an increase of over $600,000, right? So we know the expense-based aids went down by $21,873. The other aid categories went down by $2,800. UPK, again, I put an asterisk here because it's truly a zero. It's just an error on the part of the state. So there was no change to their UPK. And the change to the foundation aid was $233,113. So again, their true increase in new revenue, if you will, new cash, is really only $208,431, not the 3.9% that was advertised by the state and will be reported by Newsday, but less than 2% because they only got the guaranteed 2% on foundation aid, and these other categories reduce it even further. So that is Bayport Blue Point's story. So that's what they have to sell and communicate to their stakeholders. That's what they're going to be utilizing with their budget development, along with their proposed tax levy. That's the new money. Any changes to the budgets, adds or reductions, this is what they have to go. But first, they have to explain, no, we didn't get 3.9%. We only got less than 2%. And so you have to start off the conversation combating an error made by the state and will be reported by Newsday. So guaranteed minimum increases. So what are we asking for this year? What are we going to be talking to our legislators about? We've already, at the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association, have already had conversations with some of our state officials. We're going to be meeting with them in the next week or so. And these are the things that we're going to be talking to them about based on the governor's proposal. So guaranteed minimum increases, we're going to be asking for a minimum of 4% as opposed to 2% to help offset the inflationary gaps that we spoke about earlier, right? So if you're one of those Save Harmless districts, talk to your state officials. We need more than 2%. Make it 4% because, again, we know there was a 5% gap over the last 2 years, particularly if you were one of those districts that received 0% increase the previous year. A guaranteed minimum increase of 4% in the foundation aid formula as opposed to 2% seems fair to help combat the inflationary environment that we've all lived under. Allocate funds to the Rockefeller Institute to conduct a full study on how to fully reform the foundation aid formula. In the Rockefeller Institute's report, on their first page with the forward, in the second paragraph, they said, if we had more than 7 months to do this study, we would have done a deeper dive or a broader study. So they were even asking, wow, this is what we've been able to accomplish in 7 months. If we had more time, there would have been other things that we would have explored. So what we're saying is there's no economic crisis in New York State. Quite to the contrary. The governor's budget presentation showed that the economy in New York is strong. projections are coming in, the revenue is coming in well above projections. The revenue came in $6 billion more than what was projected. The governor's proposal will increase the state's reserves to $21 billion. And the budget director says that the projections going forward for the state of New York is very optimistic and very strong. And he had a quote, when Wall Street does well, we do well. And that's something we all need to remember, that a lot of revenue that is generated in Wall Street benefits New York State. So they're very optimistic about going forward. So what we're saying is give more money to the Rockefeller Institute and let them go back and do a full study of the foundation aid formula. And we're requesting that they do a new costing out study for what a successful schools model looks like to provide a sound basic education to every student in the state of New York and recalibrate the base foundation aid amount. The Rockefeller report had a whole host of recommendations for everything and made changes to almost every aspect of the formula except the starting point, the base foundation aid amount. And why is that important? Because that base foundation aid amount cost out study was originally done prior to the foundation aid formula being adopted in 2007. It's only been recalibrated a couple of times to try to catch up with inflationary costs, but it doesn't include costs like mental health services that we're all rendering to our students and will continue to render. Those are escalating costs and escalating needs that we see every day. Increased costs for school safety and security of our campuses. We are all doing more to make sure our campuses and our students and our staff are safe, whether it be through hiring security guards, armed or not armed, technology, cameras, hardening entrances and hardening our campuses, metal detectors, whatever we've been doing, the security that we've been putting in place to combat cybersecurity threats, right? We just had, a breach of data for one of our third-party vendors, but schools are prime targets for cybersecurity threats and the other technology improvements that we've been investing in for computer-based testing and one-to-one devices, so remote learning. All these investments that we've made are not reflected in that base foundation aid amount, that first step of the formula before everything else kicks in to figure out how much foundation aid our district is entitled to. So again, give the Rockefeller Institute another year to study what they didn't get to study in the only 7 months that they had last year, and also making sure that we start with step one and recalibrate that base foundation aid amount. Another major priority, we have to pump the brakes on this zero emission bus mandate at a minimum. We need to delay these mandates. These mandates are taking effect very, very soon for new bus purchases. They're going to be impacting all of our transportation costs, whether you have your own buses or you subcontract out. We need our legislator and our governor to step up and delay the mandates with regards to zero emission buses. The infrastructure just is not there to carry out what the law says is going to be necessary and the mandates that it is imposed upon us. It's important to note that the state's own mandate with their own fleet of vehicles, state-owned vehicles, they've pushed back the zero emission mandates for themselves. We're asking the same thing for us. So those are just two major things. There are a host of other advocacy things. You can see our website as far as our state and federal legislative priorities for the upcoming season. But with regards to the budget, again, increase the guaranteed minimum increases from 2 to 4%, and then give more money to the Rockefeller Institute. They did a great job with the first report. I was really surprised with how well they explored the aspects of the formula. There were some troubling things in there for us, particularly talking about reserves that we weren't happy about, but we want to give them more time to look at the areas of the formula that they couldn't, but most importantly, recalibrating the base foundation aid amount. You can't change every other aspect of the formula and not update the very starting point of that formula so that it reflects the true costs of delivering a sound basic education. And I just gave you three major categories: mental health supports that we provide for our students, safety and security of our campuses, security infrastructure and technology. There's other things that we do on a daily basis that is the new expectation of providing a sound basic education to every student in New York State. And our base foundation aid amount needs to be updated to reflect that. So, what talking points should you develop for your own district when you are doing your legislative sessions with your elected officials? And again, have these conversations with your state officials. We're having them on your behalf. We have met with our state assembly folks and state senators 3 different times now to talk about a variety of issues. We're going to be meeting with them again very soon to talk about this particular budget proposal. And these are going to be the things that we're going over with them. So this will not be new to them being heard, but it's important that you tell your own individual school district story. Just like Bayport Blue Point's story is a little different than anybody else's because of what the state senators and assembly people who represent their district, they're going to look at that state aid run and say, oh, we got 3.9%, 600, okay, not too shabby. No, we need to have a further conversation about what it is and what we need you to do. So reserves are an issue. Reserves are a big issue for our state officials. They're an issue for the comptroller. We are advocating to push back against the 4% in undesignated reserves that we're allowed. Again, the state has $21 billion sitting in reserves. We're the only municipality that is restricted to 4% in undesignated reserves. We're advocating for us to have at least 10%. But until we get there, 4% is the law. The comptroller will come in. If you're over the 4%, you're going to get dinged. Newsday is going to report it. But this is something that, as board members, we should be aware of what our reserves are, both designated and undesignated reserves. And with the undesignated reserves, are you over the 4%? And, sometimes you are. If you're a district that has received a catch-up of all your foundation aid, you're probably over the 4% because you got this huge influx of money over the last couple of years. What do you do with it? And you can't expend it all in one budget cycle, right? So if you're over the 4%, have the conversation with why and what is our plan to get under the 4%, or what is our plan with our reserves in general. You should be having these conversations with your audit committee, and your business officials, and your leadership team, and your superintendent about what does our reserves look like. Because you're going to have that community member that's going to sit there and say, you got tens of billions of dollars sitting in these reserves. Well, some of the reserves we can't touch, right? Capital reserves, repair reserves, insurance reserves, they're designated for specific purposes. But if you're over the 4% in the undesignated reserves, you should have a game plan on how you're communicating with what you're doing with those funds, okay? So have that as a talking point, have that ready. What has your enrollment done over the last 10 years? Are you a district that has seen an increase in enrollment? Are you a district that has seen a decrease in enrollment? And every board and every governance team has shifted and adjusted for enrollment changes as they have happened over 10 years. So to make any immediate change because of change in enrollment in a singular year when it's taken place over a decade, you've probably reduced class sizes. Maybe you now can afford more AP courses. Maybe you've closed a building. Maybe you've done other things to adjust for your changes in enrollment. Have that story ready. Yes, our enrollment dropped X, but through attrition, we reduce our teaching staff, or we reduced our class sizes. They used to be 26 and now they're 23. Whatever your individual story is, develop your story about what has happened over the 10 years with your change in enrollment. How has the demographics of your changes in your district been, right? Have you had an influx of special ed? Have you had an influx of E&L students? We've been making the argument that they're not empty seats that you're paying for. The needs of the students have changed. We've seen an increase in E&L on Long Island, English as a new language, a huge increase in special ed, students being classified. So the needs have changed. So if you dropped one student, maybe the needs have more than compensated for your change in enrollment. And again, if you've had an enrollment change of only maybe 5%, you're not losing an entire class, because that enrollment change is K through 12. It's not one particular class. You still have to have that science teacher. You still have to have that third grade teacher. So have that story ready about your enrollment change. And more importantly, what are your future enrollment projections? You should have an idea as to what your future projections are with enrollments. Are they continuing to go down? What is our game plan if they continue to go down? Be ready to have those conversations, because I'm telling you, your state officials will want to have that information but when they're advocating for us back up in Albany, because that's what they're hearing. Enrollment's dropping, the number of residents in New York has changed. Again, how have your demographics changed over the last 5 to 10 years? Have you seen an increase in poverty in your district? Long Island has gotten poorer over the last 10 years, without a doubt, which is why we were advocating for the change in the poverty index measure, because it was not reflective of our current reality. So know what the change in your demographics have been. Student need changes, again, we've touched on this. Mental health, school attendance has been an issue post-COVID nationwide, and certainly here on Long Island. Learning loss, remediation, what are you doing to help catch kids up, right? Have those stories ready, and what has that meant as a budget impact? You should be able to tell these stories, to have an expression. Know your story, tell your story, sell your story. This is part of the homework, to know your story, looking at these particular categories, because these are things that are relatable. These are things that the legislature and the governor have all talked about. They're all talking about the mental health crisis of our students. So what is the story in your individual district? Are you having attendance issues like so many districts across our nation are post-COVID with re-engaging students? Are you having an increase in special ed classifications? Are you having an increase in ELL? Know your individual district story. And, highlight your successes, right? Be honest about your challenges, accentuate the positive. And what are you doing to eliminate the negative? It's an old expression in a song: accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative. And how are you working to improve, and the investments that will be necessary to do that? Are you still offering tuition assistance, not tuition assistance, but maybe summer school programs or extended learning days or extended school years to help your students catch up? Maybe you're getting set to make investments in career tech education programs in your district. Let your legislators know what you're thinking in the future and what it's going to take to get there and why. Work closely with your superintendents and governance team to develop these talking points, right? No lone wolf approaches. You all should be on the same page, and you should all be saying and rowing in the same direction. Because if your legislators are getting mixed messages, I can guarantee you they're not going to take those mixed messages up to Albany, which is why as a region, we work very closely with our local superintendent associations to see what their advocacy priorities are, what our advocacy priorities are, and where we are aligned, we make sure that we're rowing in the same direction. And more often than not, we are aligned with what our regional priorities are. And, I would hope that the superintendents and the business officials that may be watching this video will weigh in with you and say, yeah, no, a lot of those issues are our issues, and we're advocating for the same thing. We talk all the time. So a few cautions about your advocacy going forward. It's a highly politically charged environment. The governor has done a 360 on Save Harmless. Last year, she wanted to eliminate it. She came out after the Rockefeller Institute report, said, no, we're not going to do away with it. And she's been doing a lot of things that people have been scratching their heads about. But the politics of it is, there's talk that her own party is going to primary her in 2026. So a lot of this may be politically driven. I don't know. But politics does impact negotiations in Albany, without a doubt. So with that being said, avoid the partisanship, avoid the political game that's going to be played, even with those within the same party, right? When speaking with your state officials, they might want to say, hey, join me in a rally or press conference. Get some more information about that press conference, get some more information about that rally, make sure it's on point with what you're advocating for, and you're not being sucked into something that's going to be viewed as highly partisan. It could have a negative impact on your advocacy strategy, right? You have to be careful. You want to work with your state officials, but know that sometimes they're playing the partisan game. That's it's the dance, as I call it, right? And if politicians politically in trouble, they're going to be those that take advantage of it because they will see an opportunity. Just make sure you're staying on point with advocating for the kids, right? It's not R, it's not D, it's K for us. That's what I tell people all the time. First, it's kids in the middle, and it's kids at the end. Just be careful of not getting sucked into that and being used as a political pawn, because sometimes that does happen. Most of our elected officials are straight up and they understand, and have an honest conversation with them. Senator, I'm sorry, I can't participate in that. I don't want to be perceived as being biased one way or the other. I want to make sure I'm focused on kids in our community, right? And again, when it comes to budget issues, this is a geopolitical issue. It's not party, right? Downstate New York, Long Island, Westchester, Lower Hudson Valley, we have very different priorities than our colleagues in rural upstate New York, right? Than the city systems, small city, the big five, other parts of upstate New York. We're aligned in a lot of cases, but when it comes to dollars, sometimes it becomes very geopolitical. So again, be careful what the message is. Just keep it focused on the facts and your story and how it benefits your district. And if you're going to be sending letters to your governor or state officials, or you're going to be quoted in the media, keep it factual, not accusatory. Don't inflame it. Don't be over the top. Not Chicken Little. The world is coming to an end. Oh my goodness. Stay factual. Tell your story. Know your story. Tell your story. Sell your story. And try to avoid being negative whenever possible. Keep it always positive, right? And if you're going to do a letter writing campaign, I can tell you most officials, the letters should be individual. If you do these massive form letters and you have 300 people writing the same thing, and I've seen some of these where they don't even change some of the things that you send out as a template, I would avoid doing that. Have folks write their own individual letter and how it's impacting them individually. That goes a long way compared to them and their offices and their staff receiving 300 form letters saying the same thing, and the form sometimes is not good. Let's put it that way. And remember, this proposal is the first step in the process. It's not the last step. The first step is the governor makes a proposal. Now the Senate and the Assembly, they're going to come out with their budget proposals. Then they get together and they come to an agreement as part of the legislature, and they'll be negotiating with the governor every step of the way. And a lot of these things, there'll be some what I like to refer to as horse trading back and forth for a lot of budget priorities, right? Education is one part of the budget. It's the second biggest part of the budget, next to Medicaid and healthcare. But it's part and parcel of an entire budget process with competing interests and a lot of budget priorities coming from many different directions, and things are negotiated all the time. So remember, this is the first step in the process, but this is the beginning of when you need to look at how these dollars and cents are going to impact your district, so that you know your story, tell your story, and sell your story to your local state officials so they can take your story up to Albany and advocate in an effective, proactive way for our entire region. And again, we are meeting with state officials. We're staying on top of any of the changes that could negatively impact us from a budgetary standpoint. And we're going to continue to have these conversations. We'll be participating in the legislative forums. My email is there at the bottom. If you have any questions or any issues, don't hesitate to reach out. Give me an email, give us a call, and let us help you. It's always a pleasure to serve you here at the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association. I hope this presentation is helpful in helping you better understand your school state aid runs and how confusing it can be, but really to break it down in a very simple form so that as a governance team, you can make informed, smart decisions with the investments that you're going to make in your district and your student success going forward. So we thank you for tuning in. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Also, if you can, email us and provide us feedback on this presentation. Instead of doing a webinar, we're doing this on demand so that you could watch it at your leisure. And if you want to watch it multiple times, I don't know why you'd want to see this multiple times, but I hope the information is helpful. And if you need other information, reach out. And good luck this budget season, and hope to see you at many of the advocacy events that will be ongoing in the months ahead.